Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for today's webinar. I'll just make a few brief introductory comments before we start. My name is Neil Ward. I'm based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the AFN Network Plus, which is a network focused on the UK agri-food system and identifying and tackling the barriers to transitioning to a net zero UK. It's funded by UKRI, which is the umbrella body for the British Research Councils, and we're running for 3 years up until mid-2025. So through the network, we're gathering together people and organisations from across the UK agri-food sector, and we're hosting a range of activities to promote interactions, connections and knowledge exchange. We're commissioning some research projects during 2023 and 2024. And we're working on some future scenario work, which we're going to be airing at an event in Leeds next week on the 26th and 27th to discuss some of the outcomes of the scenario work and research priorities for the future. You can sign up to become a member of the network. I think Jez will be able to put a link in the chat to the website where you can join and get updates on what we're doing. Today is the second webinar in our webinar series. We're usually aiming to hold these on Fridays and a few weeks apart. But having said that, our third event is coming up very quickly on Monday, which is with Henry Dimbleby. So that's Monday the 24th. And I'll give you more details about that at the end of today's session. But today, we're very pleased to have Dr. Stephen Mackenzie with us. Stephen is the technical lead for modelling greenhouse gas emissions in food systems at WRAP, which stands for Waste and Resources Action Programme. He's playing a major role in the charity's recently launched Retailer Net Zero Collaborative Action Programme, collaboration between WRAP, WWF and 8 UK retailers that aims to accelerate emissions reduction in the food and drink sector. Prior to joining WRAP, Stephen spent 10 years in academic research roles at Newcastle University, Trinity College Dublin and the University of Edinburgh, developing life cycle assessment models to quantify the environmental impacts of food production. So Stephen's going to speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. We will finish at 1 o'clock prompt. I'll say a few words just at the end about our future programme. Please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll try and get through as many of these as we can in the time. We're recording today's session, and we'll be aiming to put it on our YouTube channel so that other people can see it in future. So if you don't want to be identified as participating, probably best not to ask a question. Okay, so without further ado then, I'll hand over to Stephen for his presentation. Stephen.
Thanks so much, Neil, and thank you so much to you and all the network conveners and Jez for the invite to give this talk at this session today. I'm just going to share some slides to help move through this talk. And yes, thanks for the introduction. I would be hoping to talk to you all today, and thanks to everyone who's joined, about some of the work that we've been doing with WRAP, at WRAP with the UK food sector on particularly their ambitions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the kind of targets and pledges that they're signed up to, and also effectively how some of the challenges that we're seeing and getting feedback that they are experiencing on the subject of measuring and reporting their greenhouse gases kind of have implications and kind of highlight wider challenges that the sector's facing in kind of bringing the, I guess, the finance and the investment and everything else needed to actually make some of the reductions and take some of the investment decisions needed. So yes, I should just, Neil's introduced kind of WRAP as an organisation there, but I should just give a little bit more on that. Before I do, just to say the agenda I was hoping to cover today would be an overview and the principles of the kind of working groups that we run under Courtauld, and I'll come on to what Courtauld is in a second. a bit of a top-down view on the work that we've been doing on sources of GHG emissions in the UK food systems and the trends in recent years. As I've just mentioned, some of those barriers and kind of issues that we're finding on the measurement and reporting side, which are kind of indicative of wider things that are causing inertia on decisions and in investment and kind of scaling up the innovation that's needed. And also a bit about that initiative that we've recently launched that Neil mentioned at the start, called the Retailer Net Zero Collaborative Action Programme, with most of the UK's major supermarkets, and what we're planning to do with that over the next few months, and I suppose the potential opportunities, a little bit about the ways of working that we do in groups like that, and the opportunities and kind of how the need to make links with kind of big key touch points like this group as well. So just a little bit about RAP. There's kind of three major voluntary agreements that we run: the UK Plastics Pact, the Courtauld 2030 commitment, which is all about three different sustainability targets for the UK food sector, and Textiles 2030. Clearly, I'm speaking to you guys as the Agri-Food for Net Zero Network, so I'm going to focus on what we're doing under Courtauld, and particularly when considering Courtauld, what we are doing on the kind of one of the three targets that we have, which is signatories sign up to as to contribute when they join the agreement, and that's to kind of play their part in the UK sector as a whole trying to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% at the kind of midpoint deadline of 2030, and the kind of details of that target and how it was set up from a 2015 baseline are all kind of tied into the kind of milestone, the upcoming milestone that many businesses are signing up to under science-based targets in terms of a kind of 50% reduction around that date. There's a little bit of variation in there depending on exactly when a business signs up to science-based targets, and there's a kind of a special calculation tool for how that works, and it's also kind of in line as much as it can be with the projections and the models that the UK Committee for Climate Change make, and the kind of requirements on the UK food sector to reduce its emissions in line with those carbon budgets. And I should just say, as a general kind of overview of all, it's got lots and lots of businesses across the whole value chain in UK food, and not just businesses, also industry bodies and other kind of key stakeholders signed up. It is as I say, a kind of vehicle, a governance vehicle for convening pre-competitive discussions and kind of ways of collaborating between these key actors on, as I mentioned, those three different targets. There's another target on food waste, and there's another target on water stewardship, which I probably won't cover too much today, given the focus of this network on net zero. But I'm sure we all know there's always crossover between these work areas. It's not always good just to have tunnel vision on the greenhouse gases, and clearly the work on food waste and water stewardship has intersections and implications for that work. So,
Stephen, can I just see whether you can make your slides bigger? Are you able to put them on a presentation view?
Oh,
sorry to interrupt.
At this end, it looks like they are on presentation view, but I can stop that and correct that quickly. I do apologize to everyone.
We could see them, but it would be good if they could just be a bit bigger.
Yeah. Is that the same problem?
No, that's perfect. I think. Does everyone see that? Okay. Shout in the chat if you can't. I think that's better. Yeah.
That's great. Lovely. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. That's great.
Okay. Just yeah, classic amateur hour Zoom issue from there. Apologies, everyone. And yeah, just to say, under the kind of GHG work stream that we have with that group, we work on a number of different work areas. particularly focused around the way that UK food businesses kind of measure and report their Scope 3 emissions, a kind of overall system of tracking, as I mentioned, and I'll come on to that in a second, UK food emissions from a kind of a system level model, some particular work with those involved with the livestock sector on meeting the net zero world, and particularly now a working group focused on feed emissions from animal feed and kind of convening the relevant actors there, given that being such a key issue for the UK entry as a whole, and also a bit more of a broader convening role, a forum that we run to kind of bring together and present in kind of concise 90-minute blocks, for particularly aimed at kind of technical managers working in UK food businesses, like different projects, bits of innovation on reducing emissions in UK agri-food, and we've kind of connected in the past year or so with some of the organisations that are no doubt involved in this network, the kind of centres of excellence, the likes of CL and CHAP and some of the others on what they're doing in that space to try and kind of give quite sharp downloads to the sector in one place where you can get quite a few people on a forum, and also work with the partners at Oxford and at university and WWF and other partners on the issue of what data and what data on emissions from key UK food products is available to the sector, and kind of running that through a harmonised platform called Hestia that's set up to do that. So there's kind of some of the work streams that we have been working on in the past couple of years, or more recently in some cases. And as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the net zero, a new kind of working group and way that we've set up to work shortly in this talk. So just to give a bit of an overview of how we then present the picture to the sector on their kind of progress towards that target. So we have this model that we update every year called the UK Food System GHG model. It's obviously not the only kind of model and way of tracking this out there, but it's a fairly consolidated one that we've put together that looks to kind of get to where the key sources of emissions are, and also kind of what the progress at the system level looks like. We can see from the analysis that we published in 2021, our estimate is that kind of over half of those emissions, and this is all the emissions associated with consumption of food in the UK, not just say the domestic production or anything like that. Over half of that is coming from kind of production practices, both in the UK and overseas, slightly more weighted towards the UK there, and the domestic production, but then also a key aspect of that is the deforestation associated with some of those commodities and imports. And then you can see kind of the rest of it being made up by small portions of emissions kind of coming from the supply chain from there on in terms of processing, in terms of transport, refrigeration, kind of on-site emissions in retail, and all these kind of other bits, and also some stuff related to home use and disposal as well. Being RAP, we obviously had to give an estimate of kind of how much of that was related to food waste. It's actually quite interesting to see some of the work coming out recently that's probably suggesting, certainly at the global level, that the proportion of GHG emissions associated with food waste is possibly higher than that, and it may be interesting to kind of do a bit more digging into whether that is whether there's any kind of any issue with the modelling that we've done there, or whether it's more just a case of the UK food system being a slightly different case and having maybe less food waste associated with it. But also, I think we're fairly certain, in comparison to other international systems, less emissions associated with the food that's wasted due to the way that it's disposed, as opposed to a lot of it going to landfill. So that's the kind of overall picture that we see in terms of source of emissions. I mean, I think this network, when it was set up, was very well aware of the kind of the importance of on-farm emissions and driving those down, and kind of that being where the real questions for the net zero pathway are. We also, as part of that work, tried to plot for the sector a pathway, and I mean, it's just one theoretical pathway, but a pathway towards this interim target, specifically this kind of crunch point of trying to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. You can see there that actually, in comparison to maybe some of the sources of emissions that I showed on the previous slide, that the estimates of what was possible in that short-term period of reducing on-farm emissions are maybe quite conservative, and then there's some other quite stretching targets in terms of eliminating emissions from tropical deforestation. I mean, most of the sector is signed up to relevant pledges on that at this point. The question is delivery and kind of action towards that, and oversight of whether that's being effective, and to kind of show that within that pathway there is there's emissions reductions that will come kind of into the system as predicted, progress on decarbonising the grid and reducing food waste, and also kind of come in. And I think we can say, if you dig down into more detail as to where we can see progress currently, they're the areas that you kind of can see progress on reducing emissions. And then also a pretty conservative kind of estimate of or scenario for dietary change, I would say. So one that was kind of in line with maybe things that UK government are already recommending, rather than you might see some more ambitious scenarios for dietary change, and kind of changes in consumption patterns relating to things like livestock products and the like elsewhere in other people's kind of modelling. And yeah, just to say that what we can track kind of through the first 6 years of data that we can see going into that model that we have are a level of reduction that is fairly steady, and you can see a kind of steady level of reduction over time. We estimate about 12% reduction in gross emissions from the system. But you can also see, as you kind of tick towards that 2030 target, that those emissions, the kind of rate of reduction needs to ramp up and increase quite significantly if we are to meet that target. And I think that's kind of where we end up having a lot of conversations with the sector and industry about the kind of need to really accelerate action. To be honest, I'm not sure how much we need to say that at this point. I think everyone's kind of aware of it. The question is how and the details, and kind of what to invest in, and what to kind of take the difficult decisions on. Yeah. So if we move on to, I suppose, in that context, why we set up this particular group that we have within Courtauld, this supply chain working group on Scope 3 emissions. We were having a lot of feedback from businesses that they all had kind of individual targets, individual plans in place that required that they kind of track their emissions. There was quite a lot of feeling across the sector that people were doing it in different ways. And that also, so if we take, for instance, that group of supermarkets and retailers that we'll talk on a bit later, that the way that they were sending requests through the supply chain for this kind of data then felt suppliers are kind of being overwhelmed with increasing requests for different types of sustainability information, either related to greenhouse gas emissions or otherwise. But generally, it's kind of creating a situation where this data isn't necessarily available to the sector and being used to kind of drive decisions that on reducing emissions that it could be. And just to say from this slide that I'm going to put up here, that you can see that in this kind of quite this kind of picture of lots and lots of different standards and protocols to which people might report their greenhouse gas emissions data, and also different voluntary reporting mechanisms. We're obviously in the place right now in the UK where there is nothing that is kind of forcing it as a mandatory mechanism for businesses to report their entire scope 3 emissions, kind of going right through their value chain. There are obviously mechanisms in place now that encourage that in terms of the task force for climate-related financial disclosures, and on the big businesses there is an emphasis on them to do that, but it doesn't actually mandate it. And more generally, more and more things are coming down the track in that sense, in terms of the work that's now currently going on task force for nature-related financial disclosures. There is also kind of work being driven by the Treasury in follow-up to all of that, on businesses being required to produce transition plans to kind of demonstrate, well, what are their main kind of plans for implementing all of this, and seeing through the changes that would actually drive the reductions in these pledges that they've made and targets that they've signed up to. And all of that generally becomes quite a confusing picture for the sector to interpret. So given all of that, in May of last year, we at RAP published a set of documents and protocols that tried to interpret some of that picture and put it all in one place for the sector, and make some recommendations and requirements on how to report scope 3 emissions. There's various resources tied up in that, beyond just the document, which kind of, as I say, sets out our recommendations and requirements on different ways of reporting. We can see that obviously since May, things have moved on a lot. There's been new guidance specific to the food sector and the land sector more generally, from the greenhouse gas protocol. That's meant a whole kind of new set of methods and things that need to be followed on business level scope 3 reporting, particularly relating to kind of emissions on land use change, land management, the requirements on biogenic emissions that are included in the reporting. But given that this is kind of a fast-changing, fast-moving picture, over the last year, we have piloted materials that we made with 17 businesses in the Courtauld working group. They range kind of from retailers to meat processors, food processors more generally, hospitality sector companies, and also those that would be involved in kind of catering and large catering supplies and things like that. So a bit of a range of and cross section of different businesses across the supply chain. And that has all kind of highlighted a number of issues for the sector in relation to so technical issues relating to the reporting, but as I say, they're kind of representative of wider decision point issues that the sector's facing on progress towards kind of net zero pledges and reducing their greenhouse gases. So I should just say, as part of that, there's now various case studies kind of available on the RAP website from those from some of those businesses. They are, I suppose, representative of some of those challenges. Then they kind of highlight for some of the different cases where the particular business involved was at in their scope 3 reporting, and maybe some improvements that they've made. They don't necessarily go into how that data will be used within those case studies, but it's quite clear that some of that, if you kind of carry on the conversation with businesses, that these data are being used to kind of drive decisions on what they do next. And just to say, in terms of the work that we've done there and the kind of follow-up to that and where the picture sits now, there is, you may have seen, I'm not sure if I actually have a slide on it in this deck, but you may have seen that the UK government is now exploring what the mechanisms are for mandatory reporting of scope 3 emissions for the food sector through a vehicle called the Food Data Transparency Partnership. This slide is a little bit of a representation of maybe the picture right now in terms of quite a lot of voluntary reporting mechanisms. I mean, we had a slide on that earlier, but there's some voluntary reporting mechanisms that the sector is engaging with right now, all feeding into the greenhouse gas protocol and kind of deferring to the greenhouse gas protocol documents on some of the real technical issues behind that reporting. RAP trying to play a bit of a role in interpreting that guidance and interpreting that in a way that is accessible to the food sector in the UK, and also some of the challenges that it all kind of brings together in terms of data flowing through without kind of consistent inventory boundaries. So that might be at the farm level, and there's quite a key issue at farm level in the UK with differing methods in farm carbon calculators, and kind of how that then sets information with different boundaries and different kind of inputs going into it to flow through the system, and there being issues with that then being used to take decisions. Also, data availability more generally in terms of just estimates of emission factors for kind of key food products in the UK. Some of that data being very old in some cases, and so, or certainly some of the data that businesses are using being very old, and there being kind of a challenge now in how they interact with some of those reporting mechanisms to bring in data that their suppliers are providing them, and kind of justifying. There's an issue going on at the moment with justifying how that's kind of changing the inventories that they're reporting on scope 3, and potentially showing quite large reductions because they've been using kind of static values to represent the greenhouse gas emissions of certain food products for a long time. There's also issues in those standards, and this probably is quite a significant issue for how all this is treated in future, on how they recognise emissions reductions from carbon removals in terms of from various kind of land-based mechanisms to do that. The barrier on including that in reporting inventories from a data quality perspective is extremely high for food businesses if they're going to follow these standards. And then I'll show on the next slide, if we kind of look at some of the projected policies that the UK has on kind of food system emissions, and where progress on that issue is going to come from as a whole, why that represents quite a key barrier maybe to realizing some of the goals that have been set down, and also some issues on kind of verification of assurance and kind of how anyone can be sure that this data is all being kind of collected and put together in the same way when it's being, as I say, being used to make quite big decisions. So just to go back to the picture, so following on from all of that, RAP have been working on some rules around kind of how to track emissions for certain scenarios, and kind of how to use certain bits of data from the supply chain to represent your emissions from different food products. The kind of key bits of this work that we're doing at the moment with the sector are on certification schemes, the representation of kind of key interventions that we know, kind of key bits of qualitative information about the supply chain that we know would be have a significant impact on reducing emissions. So for instance, there's been some great work by CL and CHAP in recent years on maybe what some of those kind of key interventions are for key groups, kind of key aspects of the livestock sector, or key crop commodities or otherwise. And there's a kind of issue about how that's treated in emissions reporting, and also the supplier data being supplied directly, kind of whether that's all being done in a consistent way, whether it can be trusted and used and kind of to represent the emissions flowing into, say, a big hospitality company or a retailer or whoever who's kind of making purchasing decisions. And the reason why we're focusing on that, and as I say, on those issues, and kind of why it reflects a wider issue for that pathway to net zero more broadly, is as I'm going to show a couple of things on this slide, there's kind of quite a fair bit amount of consensus and acknowledgement in the sector now that there's this large finance gap kind of between what's needed to drive the progress and kind of invest in key innovations, whether they be on farm relating to all the kind of things that a lot of this network are probably focused on some of these issues specifically in terms of land-based emissions, in terms of methane inhibitors, in terms of cover crops, all these kind of specific things that you need to implement. There's quite a lot of these things that are fairly well known at this point, and fairly well known drivers of emission reductions. But if companies aren't kind of able to account for some of those things in their reporting data, it's very hard, and the information that they're getting from their supply chain, it's very hard to see how maybe some of the private sector investment that the reports like the ones released by the Green Finance Institute highlighted are needed to kind of plug that gap between the scale of what could be delivered under government policy right now versus what's needed, and kind of generating and implementing that investment to kind of drive these innovations. Although I would say, from some of the conversations that we've had recently at RAP, actually there doesn't appear to be a problem with raising some of the finance from some of the kind of key actors in that space. It's just how to use it. And I would also say, yeah, looking at there's a graph on the left that I've kind of pulled there from a report that Carbon Brief released recently about kind of more generally sector pathways in the near term and what government policies might deliver, and you can see that quite a lot of the predicted kind of progress on greenhouse gases from the UK farming sector is based on driving carbon removal or action on carbon removals. It's probably almost the shallowest of any line there on the in the middle there in terms of the progress on reducing the emissions from the kind of produced by the various products and kind of key aspects of that like the livestock sector there. So a lot of the kind of progress and the imagined pathway there is based on carbon removals. And I will now move on. I think I am going a little bit over time, but I'll try and keep pressing on to talk about the announcement that probably caught Neil and Jez's eye, which is why we were kind of invited to talk to you today. So at RAP recently, we launched a new program called the Retailer Net Zero Collaborative Action Program. That program is with a number of UK supermarkets in a bit of an acknowledgement that there needs to be that maybe we can make more use of some of these structures that we have under Courtauld to drive action and kind of link with other key initiatives, to have a joined up conversation with them and other initiatives. I mean, they're investing kind of their teams. I'll show something in a minute that was sent to us recently by one of them about all the kind of different initiatives that they're trying to get involved with to drive action on this. And you can imagine some of this this activity being replicated across all these teams, with them funding different pilots and different kind of things to try and drive action on farm emissions or change consumption patterns or whatever else it is. And so that there's a feeling that we can be more powerful if we can try and join up a consolidated conversation there. There's 8 of the UK retailers involved. I've put the logos up there. They represent about 80% of the market share for UK grocery retail. And they're very keen to kind of talk to us on both aligning about scope 3 emissions and the emissions reporting as a kind of acknowledgement that the way that they do that needs to be consistent, to be fair to the sector and the supply chain, and to also increase trust in kind of what they're reporting at the end of the day. And then also to scope those kind of further opportunities on what comes next, and kind of how we increase the level of ambition there. And as I mentioned, so there's an emphasis on the group to kind of come together and be clear about the set of standards and methods that they're going to adopt on scope 3 reporting, to also come together and try and build a bit of a shared evidence base on what the sector is doing right now in terms of all the different kind of bits of innovation and programs and pledges and initiatives that they've signed up to. And then to try and kind of use that picture and analyze it to get a bit of a readout on where the kind of action that would move the dial isn't happening, and try and use that group as a vehicle to connect with others and effectively bring some proposals to the table that will hopefully accelerate the change and accelerate their influence on driving progress towards net zero in the UK food sector. So I'm going to give you an idea, and apologies if the person who sent me this is on this call. I don't think it's anonymized, but I don't think I asked permission to use it specifically in this presentation. But it's a representation of lots and lots of different initiatives that, for instance, one of the UK retail teams would be engaging with all at the same time on the issue of scope 3 data, scope 3 reporting, deforestation, you know, some of these kind of key aspects of the pathway, and the fact that it's not a consolidated conversation. There needs to be more of a kind of handle on where the levers for real change are, and kind of how they can more strategically invest their time and energy in kind of driving progress towards those targets that they've set up. And there's so much, you know, I've seen various versions of this kind of stuff in different forums. There's some other great forums, things like the Scope 3 peer group go on, that kind of show that we're getting kind of initiative overload with setting up lots and lots and lots of different groups on various issues, and it's just so hard to keep track of kind of where things are going and what the most important things to be involved with are. So just to kind of summarize in terms of that particular initiative that we're engaged with, there's a real opportunity in the next few months as we kind of build towards the phase 2 of that group and what it really does, and what the kind of key things that programs that it might be prepared to invest in are, is to have a consolidated conversation with the vast majority of the UK grocery retail sector on scaling their ambitions for GHG mitigation. And there's a desire from that group to connect with other kind of consolidated points of knowledge to scale up and deliver innovation. I mean, lots of them might be working through their agri teams with some of the people on this call on kind of different specific projects. And I suppose there's more focused from them than there's ever been on the kind of short-term timescale for the key milestones that they've made on these net zero pledges. So lots of them, if they've signed up to science-based targets, have kind of things in place for in and around 2030. And then again, depending on where they are as a group, for targets in and around 2040 or somewhere between 2040 and 2050, and they're kind of quite focused on particularly that 2030 interim milestone at this point, that it's coming fast, and they've made pledges through those targets to kind of have sharp reductions in their emissions. There are challenges in the way that we operate groups like that, particularly around we come up against barriers on competition law, and kind of how we can when we're talking about their involvement in different kind of private sector initiatives. That's always a challenge for us in terms of the group there. There's also there's a wider challenge for the whole sector in kind of understanding what the scale of investment needed is, and kind of some fundamental challenges to their business models. I mean, I put up on the slide before some of the stuff from the Green Finance Institute on kind of seeing that top-down view of the UK on the investment gap. There's some other work that came out recently. If you think about it specifically from the perspective of the supermarkets, if I think about some of the work that's been coming out of City University recently and some of the reports that they've been doing on kind of how some of the fundamental aspects of business models there would need to change if they were going to drive some of the progress towards net zero emissions. And it's very difficult more broadly with that kind of level of initiative overload and all the different things that people are signing up to, the different reporting requirements coming for the supply chain, which doesn't have, say, a huge amount of resources to dedicate to large sustainability teams and kind of lots and lots of people working and focused on this issue to keep up with the requirements on reporting, the requirements on how to access, how that might impact on them to access kind of finance in the future, or some of the other innovations that are kind of flowing through the chain there. So I'll stop because I've been going quite a bit over time, I think, but I will hopefully allow some time for questions there on in.
Thanks very much, Stephen. There are a few questions already all coming in. So maybe if I just pick out this first one, which is from Andrea Zick, given that other governmental and non-governmental organisations, so CMA, DEFRA, BEIS, WWF, British Retail Consortium, etc., are working on these subjects, how do you make sure that dialogue is maintained and some consensus is being found to avoid silo thinking and solutions? So that's sort of coordinating, and there's a lot of activity. How are you dealing with that?
We spend the honest answer is that we spend a lot of time on that. We spend a lot of time talking to all of the or most of the organisations that were listed in that in that question on where our role is. There's, for instance, to give you an example on some of those, obviously WWF have been running kind of recent roundtables on farm finance, running through the sector. There is a huge amount of kind of work that could overlap, and we have, particularly with some of the groups that I mentioned, like WWF and BRC at RAP, quite detailed conversations about making sure that our work doesn't duplicate. There's obviously I don't know if it's hinted at in that question there, but there's various work going on under BRC with a kind of coalition looking at practically demonstrating scope 3 data going through business supply chains right now, and it's all about kind of we create different structures so that our work's feeding into theirs and vice versa, and it's not hopefully not duplicating and overlapping. But there is definitely still a feeling from the sector, and that's kind of what I'm trying to emphasize on that slide, that they are still getting pulled into too many groups. So yeah, to keep working and trying consolidating and making sure that you're working with the most useful vehicle for any given activity.
Okay, great, thank you. A few more coming in. Just remind people, you feel free to put questions in the chat, but here's one. How are you working on consumers' choices to move away from certain food that's got more emissions impact? So you mentioned that in the first part of your talk, the dietary change challenge, but is that out with all of this project work, or does it feature at all? Does it have any purchase?
So it is a conversation that we're planning to have through that retail and net zero cap. I think more generally, RAP is quite focused on having conversations with the supply chain as a whole and kind of thinking about all of these things needing to happen at the same time. So particularly, as much as anything else, being focused on the need to reduce emissions on farm. There is a huge amount of other organisations, if you think of us in comparison to others, who are doing a lot of the campaigning and kind of agenda setting on what the diet, what kind of healthy and sustainable diets need to be. But the need to pick up some of that work and implement it in any transition is something that we will be talking to the sector about in that Retail and Net Zero Collaborative Action Programme, because it is is unavoidable. We've heard some really good really interesting insights from that group already about kind of where plans might be going and kind of what that means if you think about from their perspective the future of a supermarket, and kind of like literally what's on shelves and how much space is given to different types of products and things like that. It may even come up in some of because there'll be other people working on this, in some of that work that you were talking about presenting in a week or two's time in the future scenario work. But yeah, so it is a conversation that we're having, but I don't think the agenda on what diet and what specific consumption change needs to be implemented is the bit that RAP's leading on. The bit that RAP's leading on is just trying to coordinate what can people agree on and what can we get a consolidated view on, because there's also some quite future facing stuff, I guess, that I think it would be really interesting to get a view on from that group, particularly in relation to the going back to that kind of measurement and reporting side of things. There is obviously lots going on in kind of other parts of the sector and elsewhere in the world on adjusting consumer choice, or giving consumers the option to adjust choices for a given goal, whether that be kind of clicking for a low carbon basket, or whether that be something else to adjust it for, say, healthy diet requirements. But I think we must be on the cusp of having some of those options come through in terms of the online space in UK retail. So it'll be really interesting to see if we can have a kind of a pre-competitive discussion there about kind of what the minimum goals might be in those kind of models. Oh, I think Neil might have just got thrown off there.
Yeah, I think Neil's dropped out. This does happen sometimes. Oh, Neil, there you are.
Sorry, just a brief moment of darkness.
Have you lost all the chat? Do you want me to paste it
yes,
back
but
in?
there was one that I was going to just put about the food retailing sector. I guess some of the sort of manufacturers and processors, it's sort of renowned as a highly competitive sector. And I just wondered, in the work that you're doing, it looks to require quite a lot of sharing and collaboration. And I just wondered about that. How does that tension work between the need for sort of common standards and sharing and mutual learning, and the highly competitive nature of the sector?
So I would say that this is where it's quite interesting that some of our conversations are transitioning at the moment from conversations about rules for measurement and reporting, which I think it's been actually surprisingly easy to have pre-competitive conversations and kind of people within what a highly competitive sector kind of acknowledging that is an issue that just needs to kind of progress and get sorted, so that they can all progress on their kind of work towards their targets. I think there's a fairly good acknowledgement there that that's not a zero-sum kind of game between themselves. Whereas it will be very interesting as we do progress onto some of those discussions on the really knotty topics like the consumption change, the dietary change that we were just discussing, as to whether we can still carry that out. And I mean, RAP's got a long history of kind of doing that on other specific subjects in terms of food waste and plastic packaging and everything else. But it will be really interesting as you kind of ramping up in this area, you're kind of ramping up the level of investment and business model decisions that you're looking at taking. It'd be very interesting if we can still keep carrying that on.
Yeah, great. There's a question from Richard Napier. As you pointed out, agreements with retailers will push reduction requirements onto the production and supply chains without paying for the changes. How is this addressed fairly? So I guess it's just that thing about sort of fairness in the costs and benefits of changes in different points of the supply chains. Have you got anything to say on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is part of that is about that, goes back to that investment gap that I was talking about, and kind of this whole idea of, and I think you do see more and more consideration, piloting of, however you want to call it, products that can be sent through supply chains that reward suppliers for this kind of data, and or reward them for taking particular actions. That's not some of the more public stuff that has been done on that might be, for instance, if I think of specific examples, within our group, Arla have been doing a lot of work on rewarding farmers for providing that data and specific innovations within that dairy sector. And there's probably a huge amount more to do on that, but I think there's quite that is definitely one of the barriers to progress at the moment, and a feeling from that supply chain that it can't go the same way that it has in the past, with that just that kind of being a requirement without any acknowledgement of the investment that it requires to provide that data and make the changes. So I think there is a kind of acknowledgement that we're going to need some quite innovative stuff on green finance and sending up in kind of incentives through that supply chain to make it work.
Yeah, okay. Amy is asking about methane and sequestration, and I think the question is about there's a lot of contention around these issues and sort of polarized debate, and just wonder whether that's impacting on your work. So about, I guess, some of the controversy around methane is about how to measure it, but there's also around how to reduce it, and then the sequestration and how to monitor and measure and make sure the rewards go to the right people and that sort of thing. So
yeah, so
quite problematic.
Yes, and I think so. For instance, recently we had some very interesting evidence at one of the working groups presented on the subject of methane inhibitors, and kind of a view on what the evidence base is there for different options. So it's a quite a specific level. I think from our understanding of that is that in some cases the horse has already started to bolt in terms of people finding ways of financing that as an innovation. And I suppose to come back, the question was actually on our view. I don't know that on these very, very technical subjects that specific technical aspects of the system that RAP should always be giving a view on. Kind of what it should be doing is encouraging the kind of things that overcome the barriers to progress. And I think despite some of the controversies, I think it's quite clear that particularly on the sequestration, there's a huge amount of potential there that at the moment, as I was talking about in relation to some of the reporting, may be quite hard to demonstrate for a company in their scope-free inventory, given some of the ways that the reporting standards are set up right now. And that probably isn't healthy in terms of kind of if the ultimate purpose of all of that is to drive good decision making and towards that innovation. I'm not sure that that we should be putting kind of prohibitive barriers on the evidence being supplied to kind of acknowledge any benefit that's going on there.
Yeah. Time's getting a bit tight, and we have a firm commitment that we finish on time. So although there are a few more questions, I think I'm probably going to just wrap up so that we definitely do finish on time. So I just want to say thanks very much for your talk, Stephen, and for addressing some of the questions that have come up. So a good second contribution to our webinar series. I just wanted to remind participants on the call that our next webinar is Henry Dimbleby on Monday. He led the National Food Strategy work and has recently published his book Ravenous. So he's going to be joining us between 1 and 2 on Monday the 24th. So feel free to join us at that. You can book to join through the link that I think Jez has put in the chat to sign up. And then after that one, we'll usually try and keep a few weeks between webinars. And the next one is Professor Charlotte Hardman from the University of Liverpool, who's going to be talking about net zero and dietary shift, and thinking about the role of psychology and poverty in influencing food choices. We're also going to try and spin some podcasts out from the webinars and from other activities. So we'll be sharing stories and insights from key people working in the agri-food sector and dealing with the net zero challenge. And just wanted to say that we'd really welcome comments and feedback from participants and suggestions for people that they'd like to hear in the webinar series or podcast interviewees. So you can get in touch with us. My email and Jez's email, both there in the chat. So that's the way you can get in touch. So thanks again, Stephen. Really nice to have you with us and to hear about all the interesting work that's going on at WRAP. And thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. And I hope you have a very good rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Neil and Jez.